a crowded square, a tired old pope, and a promise: your sins will be washed away. That, in essence, is where the story of the Crusades usually begins in Western memory. Pope Urban II speaking to nobles and peasants at Clermont in 1095, calling them to take up arms and march east. But the Crusades are much more than a single sermon or a series of holy wars. They were a centuries-long movement that changed Europe, the Middle East, and even how people thought about faith, violence, and identity. Let's open that file in the archive and walk through it carefully. What were the Crusades? If we strip away later romance and propaganda, the Crusades were armed campaigns authorized by the Pope in which participants took a religious vow and were promised spiritual rewards, especially the forgiveness of sins, in exchange for fighting for what the Church defined as a sacred cause. Today, we usually think first of those expeditions from Western Europe to the Eastern Mediterranean aimed at capturing or defending Jerusalem and surrounding regions between the late 11th and late 13th centuries. But the crusading ideas spread. The same framework, papal approval, taking the cross, spiritual rewards, was applied to campaigns in Spain and Portugal against Muslim-ruled states, the Reconquista, wars against pagans in the Baltic, attacks on heretics in Europe, like the Albigensian Crusade in southern France. Even political wars within Europe, once opponents could be labeled enemies of the Church. So the Crusades are both a set of specific wars in the Eastern Mediterranean and a broader mentality. The idea that violence could be made holy if properly directed. But to understand why this idea took hold, we need to step back a bit. The world before the First Crusade, by the late 11th century, the Mediterranean world looked very different from the age of the Roman Empire. On the Christian side, the Byzantine Empire, ruling from Constantinople, was the last remnant of the old Roman world. Greek-speaking, Orthodox Christian, wealthy, cultured, but under pressure. Western Europe was fragmented. Kings who didn't fully control their kingdoms, dukes, counts, and knights whose local power often mattered more than royal authority. An increasingly ambitious papacy trying to reform the Church and assert authority over secular rulers. Meanwhile, Western Europe was changing. Population was growing. Agriculture was improving. Warrior nobles' knights were numerous, heavily armed, and prone to violence. The Church had long struggled to restrain them with ideas like the peace of God and truce of God, limiting when and whom they could fight. On the Muslim side, across much of the Middle East and North Africa, Muslim powers ruled Arabic-speaking dynasties had once enjoyed a golden age of scholarship, trade, and political dominance. By the 11th century, new groups, including Seljuk Turks, had become major players. The Seljuks were Muslim, but not Arab. They had moved into the region, taken control of large territories, and often overshadowed older Muslim rulers. There was not one unified Muslim world any more than there was one unified Christian world. There were rival dynasties, local rulers, different legal schools, and regional loyalties. The immediate spark, Byzantium, in trouble. In 1071, the Byzantine Empire suffered a major defeat against the Seljuk Turks at the Battle of Manzikert. Over the following years, it lost much of its control over Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, a vital core of its empire. Facing internal crises and external pressure, the Byzantine emperor eventually turned to the West for help. He asked the Pope and Western rulers, not for a massive crusade, but for professional mercenaries, skilled soldiers, to help push back the Turks. What he got instead was something much larger and far less controllable. The First Crusade, a holy war, takes shape. In 1095, Pope Urban II traveled to Clermont in France. There, he addressed churchmen and nobles about the plight of Eastern Christians and the need to aid them. Different sources record his words differently, but the main points included appeal to Christian solidarity. Eastern Christians were described as suffering under Muslim rule. Call to arms. Western knights were urged to stop fighting each other and instead fight enemies of the faith. Spiritual reward. Those who went on campaign were offered remission of sins, essentially a powerful form of spiritual cleansing. Urban's message spread quickly. Preachers took it on the road. People who joined this movement were said to have taken the cross. They sewed a cross on their clothing as a visible sign of their vow. Who went not just knights, nobles with their households and retainers, peasants seeking salvation, adventure, or escape from hardship, clerics and monks, merchants, camp followers, even entire families. Some saw it as a religious duty. Others hoped for land, wealth, or status. Many probably had mixed motives, as humans usually do. Violence on the way. Jewish communities attacked. Even before they reached the Middle East, some crusading bands, especially in the so-called People's Crusade, massacred Jewish communities in the Rhineland, in parts of modern Germany. To them, tragically fighting enemies of Christ began at home. Many local bishops tried to shield Jews. Some failed, some succeeded, some were overwhelmed. This early wave of violence is a grim reminder. Crusading fervor could very quickly turn into religiously charged brutality, especially against vulnerable minorities reaching the East, and an unlikely success. The more organized forces of the First Crusade reached Byzantine territory, made uneasy alliances with the emperor, and then moved into lands controlled by various Muslim rulers. Here is an important detail. The Crusaders did not face a single unified Muslim empire. They encountered rival local powers, sometimes in conflict with each other. Through a mix of military aggression, luck, political fragmentation among their opponents, and sheer determination, the Crusaders achieved what many later contemporaries saw as miraculous. In 1098, they captured Antioch. In 1099, they took Jerusalem. The capture of Jerusalem was followed by a terrible massacre, as many inhabitants, Muslim and Jewish, and perhaps some Eastern Christians, were killed. Medieval Christian chroniclers themselves described this in brutal terms, often seeing it as divine judgment. Modern readers tend to see it as a horrifying war crime, even by the standards of the time. New states in a fragile world, out of the victory emerged several Latin Western European states in the region: the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Tripoli, the Principality of Antioch, the County of Edessa, further inland. These states were not simply foreign European colonies dropped into the Middle East. Over time, they became hybrid societies, Latin Christian elites, local Eastern Christians, Greek, Armenian, Syriac, Muslims, and Jews. Italian merchant communities, trade, diplomacy, intermarriage, and cultural borrowing all happened alongside warfare and suspicion. But they were always fragile, surrounded by more populous and often more powerful Muslim polities. The rhythm of crusading: success, failure, and adaptation. The First Crusade was the high point of dramatic success. What followed was more complicated. The Second Crusade, 1147 to 1149, when Edessa, one of the Crusader states, fell to Muslim forces in 1144, it shocked Western Christendom. Pope Eugenius III called another crusade, preached by the famous monk Bernard of Clairvaux. Kings like Louis VII of France and Conrad III of Germany took part. Hopes were high. The result was disappointing. Their campaigns in the Holy Land failed, and an attempt to attack the Muslim-ruled city of Damascus ended in retreat. Another front in Iberia saw some success for Christian kingdoms against Muslim rulers, but in the eastern Mediterranean, the crusade was a failure. The Second Crusade showed that the formula "take the cross plus march east equals victory" was not guaranteed. The rise of new Muslim leaders over the mid-12th century, powerful leaders began to emerge in the Muslim world who aimed to unite rival regions against the Crusader states. The most famous is al-Baldin, Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known in the West as Saladin. A Kurdish Muslim leader rose to power in Egypt, then extended control into Syria, forming the Ayyubid dynasty. Saladin combined piety, political skill, and military talent. He promoted the idea of jihad not just as personal struggle, but as armed defense and recovery of Muslim lands. The Battle of Ayyun and the fall of Jerusalem, 1187. In 1187, at the Battle of Hattin, Saladin decisively defeated the forces of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Many Crusader knights were killed or captured. Within months, much of the kingdom's territory fell. Later that year, Jerusalem itself surrendered to Saladin's forces. Unlike the events of 1099, this conquest did not involve mass slaughter of the city's population. Many Christians were allowed to leave upon paying ransom. Some poorer residents were freed by charitable acts of Muslim leaders. The loss of Jerusalem sent shockwaves across Christian Europe and led to the Third Crusade, 1189 to 1192. This is the crusade of famous names: Richard I of England, Richard the Lionheart, Philip II of France, Frederick I Barbarossa, the Holy Roman Emperor. It was a large, heavily armed response. Along the way, Frederick Barbarossa drowned during the journey. Philip and Richard quarreled. Philip returned home early. Richard won important victories, such as the Battle of Arsuf, and reconquered coastal cities. However, he did not retake Jerusalem. Instead, Richard and Saladin agreed to a settlement. The coast remained in Crusader hands. Jerusalem stayed under Muslim control. Christian pilgrims were allowed access to holy sites. From a devotional standpoint, this was a bittersweet outcome. The holy city remained lost, but pilgrimage and local presence survived. When ideals collide with politics, the Fourth Crusade. If there is one episode that shows how far crusading could drift from its original aim, it is the Fourth Crusade, 1202 to 1204, originally planned to strike at Muslim-held Egypt as a way to reclaim Jerusalem. The Crusaders contracted with Venice for transport. However, they failed to pay their full bill, and then got drawn into Venetian political schemes. The crusading army ended up 1. Attacking the Christian city of Zara, or Zadar, a rival to Venice. 2. Becoming involved in a Byzantine dynastic dispute. 3. In 1204, sacking Constantinople, the greatest Christian city in the East, capital of the Byzantine Empire. The city was looted. Churches and libraries were plundered. For many Eastern Orthodox Christians, this event left a wound that never fully healed, and deepened the schism between Catholic West and Orthodox East. The Fourth Crusade never reached Jerusalem. Instead, it showed that crusading energy could be diverted by political and economic interests in shocking ways. Later, Crusades and the end of an era in the East. After the Fourth Crusade, other expeditions continued. Crusades led by figures like Louis IX of France, who campaigned in Egypt and later in Tunisia. Attempts to reinforce or recapture remaining footholds along the Levantine coast, but the momentum was fading. The Mamluks, a powerful military caste in Egypt, gradually pushed the Crusader states back. In 1291, the fall of Acre, the last major Crusader stronghold in the Holy Land, marked the effective end of the Latin states there. Crusades didn't vanish overnight, but their character changed. More campaigns were directed within Europe, against rival Christians, heretics, or political enemies. The language of crusade could be used to sanctify what were essentially power struggles. The classical image of armored knights sailing east to fight for Jerusalem, however, belonged increasingly to the past. What life actually looked like in Crusader times, it's easy to imagine this era as endless battle banners and sieges. The reality, as usual, was more mixed and more human. Daily life in the Crusader states, in places like the Kingdom of Jerusalem, Latin Christian lords ruled over a population that included Eastern Christians, Greek, Armenian, Syriac, Coptic, Muslims, Jews. Trade flowed through ports like Acre, connecting Italian merchant cities, Venice, Genoa, Pisa, the interior of Syria and Palestine, markets in Egypt and beyond. There were periods of intense warfare, but also stretches of diplomacy and coexistence. Local Muslims sometimes served as farmers, craftsmen, or even soldiers under Latin rulers. Some Crusader nobility adopted local customs, from clothing styles to agricultural techniques. Truces, alliances, and intermarriage all occurred alongside religious tension and legal segregation. Cross-cultural contact, this era saw transmission of knowledge. Greek philosophical and scientific works preserved and developed in the Islamic world were translated into Latin. Medical, mathematical, and astronomical texts moved westward. Exchange of goods and techniques, sugar production methods, new fruits and spices, reaching European tables. Architectural and artistic influences on both sides. The Crusades were not the only engine of this exchange. Trade, diplomacy, and earlier contacts mattered too, but they provided a dramatic backdrop for intensified interaction, myths, misunderstandings, and how memory works. The Crusades have gathered a heavy load of legend over the centuries in both Christian and Muslim traditions, and later in modern politics. Some important clarifications. 1. Not simply religion versus religion in a neat block. There were deep religious motivations, but there were also dynastic politics, economic interests, personal ambition, and intra-Christian and intra-Muslim rivalries. 2. Islam was not a monolithic reaction. Early on, some Muslim rulers saw Crusaders as just another foreign military power. Only later did more unified, religiously charged responses emerge, especially under leaders like Saladin. 3. Crusading was a movement, not a single event. It evolved across 2 centuries. The way people talked about and justified crusading changed with time. 4. Modern uses of crusade imagery can distort history. 19th and 20th century nationalists, colonizers, and propagandists reinterpreted the Crusades through their own agendas, sometimes glorifying, sometimes demonizing, rarely being precise. From the archivist's vantage point, it's important to separate the emotional weight of these later memories from the messy, complex realities of the 11th–13th centuries. Consequences. What did the Crusades change? Historians still debate the long-term impact, but we can highlight a few key areas. For Western Europe strengthened the papacy's vision of itself as leader of Christendom, though not without backlash whenever Crusades failed. Helped shape a warrior Christian ideal where knighthood and piety could, in theory, align. Stimulated trade and maritime power, especially for Italian city-states like Venice and Genoa, contributed to a more expansive mindset, seeing the wider world as a field for Christian mission, conquest, or trade. For the Byzantine Empire, the initial idea had been to save Byzantium. Instead, the long-term effect was devastating: deep mistrust of the Latin West, physical and cultural damage from the Fourth Crusade, loss of territories, and weakening of imperial structures. Some historians see the Fourth Crusade as a key moment in Byzantium's eventual fall to the Ottomans in 1453. For the Islamic world, the Crusades were one among many challenges, alongside internal conflicts and later the Mongol invasions. They did, however, help foster ideals of resistance against foreign invaders. Legends of heroic leaders like Saladin. In some later periods, memories of the Crusades were less central than modern audiences often assume. Their prominence rose again in the age of European colonialism, when parallels were drawn between medieval crusaders and modern imperial forces. For Jewish communities, the Crusades brought waves of persecution and massacre in Europe, especially during the early campaigns. These attacks reinforced patterns of marginalization and vulnerability that would echo across centuries. In some cities, bishops and local authorities tried to protect Jews. In others, they failed or did not try hard enough. So how should we understand the Crusades today? If we close this volume too quickly, we risk turning the Crusades into a simple fable: heroes versus villains, West versus East, religion versus religion. The real story is harder and, in a way, more revealing. The Crusades show us how sincere religious devotion can coexist with brutal violence, how institutions like the medieval church can harness spirituality to pursue earthly goals, how ordinary people can be swept up in vast movements seeking salvation, security, opportunity, or simply a place in history. How cultural contact often happens in the shadow of conflict, trade alongside war, translation alongside conquest. They also remind us that no civilization speaks with just one voice. Christians argued with Christians, Muslims argued with Muslims, Jews, Eastern Christians, and others navigated these storms as best they could. From the quiet of the archive, the noise of battle recedes, and we're left with something else: a record of choices, popes deciding that violence could be sanctified, rulers balancing faith, pride, and survival, farmers, artisans, pilgrims, and soldiers trying to make sense of a world where a journey to Jerusalem might promise eternal reward and risk sudden death. If you'd like, we can pull out another file next, a closer look at a single figure like Saladin or Richard the Lionheart, or a deep dive into daily life inside the Kingdom of Jerusalem, or even how the memory of the Crusades has been used and reshaped in modern times. The shelves are full.